Theodore Robert Bundy, N.E. Cowell, November 24, 1946 – January 24, 1989, was an American serial killer who kidnapped, raped, and murdered dozens of young women and girls during the 1970s and possibly earlier. After more than a decade of denials, he confessed to 30 murders committed in 7 states between 1974 and 1978. His true victim total is unknown. 6. Bundy often employed charm to disguise his murderous intent when kidnapping victims, and with law enforcement, the media, and the criminal justice system to maintain his claims of innocence. His usual technique involved approaching a female in public and luring her to a vehicle parked in a more secluded area, at which point he would beat her unconscious, restrain her with handcuffs and take her elsewhere to be sexually assaulted and killed. Bundy typically simulated having a physical impairment such as an injury to convince his target that he was in need of assistance, or would dupe her into believing he was an authority figure. He frequently revisited the bodies of those he abducted, grooming and performing sex acts on the corpses until decomposition and destruction by wild animals made further interactions impossible. He decapitated at least 12 of his victims, keeping their severed heads as mementos in his apartment. On a few occasions, he broke into homes at night and bludgeoned, maimed, strangled, and slashed or sexually assaulted his victims in their sleep. In 1975, Bundy was arrested and jailed in Utah for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. He then became a suspect in a progressively longer list of unsolved homicides in several states. Facing murder charges in Colorado, Bundy engineered 2 dramatic escapes and committed further assaults in Florida, including 3 murders, before being recaptured in 1978. For the Florida homicides, he received 3 death sentences in 2 trials, and was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford on January 24, 1989. Biographer Ann Rule characterized him as a sadistic sociopath who took pleasure from another human's pain and the control he had over his victims, to the point of death and even after. 7. Bundy once described himself as the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet. 8. 9. A statement with which attorney Polly Nelson, a member of his last defense team, agreed. Ted, she wrote, was the very definition of heartless evil. 10. Early life and education. Childhood. Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell, 1924–2012, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers 11 in Burlington, Vermont. His biological father's identity has never been confirmed. His original birth certificate apparently assigns paternity to a salesman and United States Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall 12, though a copy of it listed his father as unknown. 13. Louise claimed she met a war veteran named Jack Worthington 14 who abandoned her soon after she became pregnant. 15. Census records reveal that several men by the name of Jack Worthington and Lloyd Marshall lived near Louise when Bundy was conceived. 16. Some family members expressed suspicions that Bundy was sired by Louise's own father. 17. However, in the 2020 documentary film Crazy, Not Insane, psychiatrist Dorothy Now Lewis claimed she received a sample of Bundy's blood and that a DNA test had confirmed that Bundy was not the product of incest. 18. For the first 3 years of his life, Bundy lived in the Philadelphia suburb of Roxborough, Pennsylvania, with his maternal grandparents, Samuel Knecht Cowell, 1898–1983, and Eleanor Miriam Longstreet, 1895–1971, who raised him as their son to avoid the social stigma that accompanied birth outside of wedlock at that time. Family, friends, and even young Ted were told that his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. Bundy eventually discovered the truth about his family, although his recollections of the circumstances varied. He told a girlfriend that a cousin showed him a copy of his birth certificate after calling him a bastard. 19. But he told biographers Stephen Michaud and Hugh Ainsworth that he had found the certificate himself. 13. Biographer and true crime writer Ann Rule, who knew Bundy personally, wrote that he did not find out until 1969, when he located his original birth record in Vermont. 20. Bundy expressed a lifelong resentment toward his mother for never telling him about his real father, and for leaving him to discover his true parentage for himself. 21. Bundy occasionally exhibited disturbing behavior at an early age. Louise's younger sister, Julia Cowell, recalled awakening from a nap to find herself surrounded by knives from the kitchen, and her 3-year-old nephew standing by the bed, smiling. 22 In some interviews, Bundy spoke warmly of his grandparents. 23 And told Rule that he identified with, respected, and clung to his grandfather. 24 In 1987, however, he and other family members told attorneys that Samuel was a tyrannical bully who beat his wife and dog, swung neighborhood cats by their tails, and expressed racist and xenophobic attitudes. In one instance, Samuel reportedly threw Julia down a flight of stairs for oversleeping. 25 He would sometimes speak aloud to unseen presences. 26 And at least once flew into a violent rage when the question of Bundy's paternity was raised. 25 Bundy described his grandmother as a timid and obedient woman who periodically underwent electroconvulsive therapy for depression. 26 And feared to leave their house toward the end of her life. 27 These descriptions of Bundy's grandparents have been questioned in more recent investigations. Some locals remembered Samuel as a fine man and expressed bewilderment at the reports of him being violent. The characterization that Sam was a raging alcoholic and animal abuser was a convenient characterization used to make people justify why Ted was the way he was, said one of Bundy's cousins. From my limited exposure to him, nothing could be farther from the truth. His daughters loved him dearly and had nothing but fond memories of him. In addition, Louise's sister, Audrey Cowell, stated that their mother could not leave her home because she suffered a stroke due to being overweight and was not mentally ill. 28 Bundy as a high school senior in 1965. In 1950, Louise changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson. 29 And, at the urging of multiple family members, left Philadelphia with Ted to live with cousins Alan and Jane Scott in Tacoma, Washington. 31 In 1951, Louise met Johnny Culpepper Bundy, 1921–2007, a hospital cook, at an adult singles night at Tacoma's First Methodist Church. 32 They married later that year and Johnny formally adopted Ted. 32 Johnny and Louise conceived 4 children together, and though Johnny tried to include his adopted son in camping trips and other family activities, Bundy remained distant from him. He would later complain to a girlfriend that Johnny was not his real father, wasn't very bright, and didn't make much money. 33 Bundy varied his recollections of Tacoma in later years. To Michaud and Ainsworth, he described roaming his neighborhood, picking through trash barrels in search of pictures of naked women. 34 And to attorney and author Polly Nelson he said that he perused detective magazines and crime novels for stories that involved sexual violence, particularly when the stories were illustrated with pictures of dead or maimed women. 35 In a letter to Rule, however, he asserted that he never, ever read fact detective magazines, and shuddered at the thought that anyone would. 36 He once told Michaud that he would consume large quantities of alcohol and canvass the community late at night in search of undraped windows where he could observe women undressing, or whatever else could be seen. 37 Psychologist Al Carlisle claimed that Bundy started fantasizing about women he saw while window peeping or elsewhere and mimicking the accents of some politicians he listened to on the radio. In essence, he was fantasizing about being someone else, someone important. 31 Bundy's childhood Tacoma neighbor Sandy Holt described him as a bully and a mean-spirited kid. He liked to terrify people. He liked to be in charge. He liked to inflict pain and suffering and fear. 31 She also alleged that Bundy engaged in animal cruelty. He hung one of the stray cats in the neighborhood from one of the clotheslines in the backyard, doused it in lighter fluid and set it on fire, and I heard that cat squealing. 31 She claimed that Bundy would take younger children in the neighborhood into the woods and terrorize them. He'd take them out there and strip them down, take their clothes, she said. You'd hear them screaming for blocks. I mean, no matter where we were here, we could hear them screaming. 31 Holt added that Bundy built makeshift punji traps around his neighborhood, injuring at least one girl. One little girl went over the top of one of Ted's tiger traps and got the whole side of her leg slit open with the sharpened point of the stick that she landed on. 31-38 Accounts of Bundy's social life also varied. He told journalists Michaud and Ainsworth that he chose to be alone as an adolescent because he was unable to understand interpersonal relationships. 39 He also claimed to have no natural sense of how to develop friendships. I didn't know what made people want to be friends, Bundy said. I didn't know what underlay social interactions. 40 Some people perceived me as being shy and introverted, he said. I didn't go to dances. I didn't go on the beer-drinking outings. I was a pretty, you might call me straight, but not a social outcast in any way. 31 Classmates from Woodrow Wilson High School, however, told Rule that Bundy was well known and well liked there, a medium-sized fish in a large pond. 41 Bundy's only significant athletic avocation was downhill skiing, which he pursued enthusiastically with stolen equipment and forged lift tickets. 13 During high school, he was arrested at least twice on suspicion of burglary and motor vehicle theft. When he was 18 years old, the details of the incidents were expunged from his record, as is customary in Washington and many other states. 42 University years. After graduating from high school in 1965, Bundy attended the University of Puget Sound, UPS, for 1 year before transferring to the University of Washington, UW, to study Chinese. 43 In 1967, he became romantically involved with a UW classmate, Diane Edwards, identified in Bundy biographies by several pseudonyms, most commonly Stephanie Brooks. 44 Bundy later described Edwards as the only woman I ever really loved. 45 In early 1968, Bundy dropped out of college and worked a series of minimum-wage jobs. He also volunteered at the Seattle office of Nelson Rockefeller's presidential campaign. 46 And became Arthur Fletcher's driver and bodyguard during Fletcher's campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington state. 47 Edwards graduated in the spring of 1968 and left Washington for San Francisco. Bundy visited her later that year after he earned a scholarship to study Chinese at Stanford University that summer. 48 In August, Bundy attended the 1968 Republican National Convention in Miami. 49 Shortly thereafter, Edwards ended their relationship and returned to her family home in California, frustrated by what she described as Bundy's immaturity and lack of ambition. Psychiatrist Dorothy Atnow-Lewis would later pinpoint this crisis as probably the pivotal time in his development. 50 Devastated by the breakup, Bundy traveled to Colorado and then farther east, visiting relatives in Arkansas and Philadelphia and enrolling for 1 semester at Temple University. 51 It was also at this time in early 1969, Rule believed, that Bundy visited the Office of Birth Records in Burlington and confirmed his true parentage. 51-52 Bundy was back in Washington by the fall of 1969, when he met Elizabeth Klopfer, identified in Bundy literature as Meg Anders, Beth Archer, or Liz Kendall, a single mother from Ogden, Utah, who worked as a secretary at the UW School of Medicine. 53 Their tumultuous relationship would continue well past his initial incarceration in Utah in 1976. 54 Bundy became a father figure to Klopfer's daughter Molly, who was 3 years old when he started dating her mother. He remained in her life until she was aged 10, after he had been arrested. As an adult, Molly wrote of incidents beginning at age 7 in which Bundy was abusive or sexually inappropriate with her. Her accounts include Bundy hitting her in the face, knocking her down, putting her at risk of drowning, indecent exposure, and sexual touching disguised as accidents or games. 55 In mid-1970, Bundy, now focused and goal-oriented, re-enrolled at UW, this time as a psychology major. He became an honor student and was well regarded by his professors. 56 In 1971, he took a job at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. There, he met and worked alongside Ann Rule, a former Seattle police officer and aspiring crime writer who would later write one of the definitive Bundy biographies, The Stranger Beside Me. Rule saw nothing disturbing in Bundy's personality at the time. She described him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. 57 After graduating from UW in 1972-58, Bundy joined Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign. 59 Posing as a college student, he shadowed Evans' opponent, former Governor Albert Rossellini, and recorded his stump speeches for analysis by Evans's Team 6061. Evans appointed Bundy to the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee 62. After Evans was re-elected, Bundy was hired as an assistant to Ross Davis, chairman of the Washington State Republican Party. Davis thought well of Bundy and described him as smart, aggressive, and a believer in the system. 63. In early 1973, despite mediocre LSAT scores, Bundy was accepted into the law schools of UPS and the University of Utah on the strength of letters of recommendation from Evans, Davis, and several UW psychology professors. 64-65. During a trip to California on Republican Party business in the summer of 1973, Bundy rekindled his relationship with Edwards. She marveled at his transformation into a serious and dedicated professional, seemingly on the cusp of a significant legal and political career. Bundy continued to date Klopfer as well. Neither woman was aware of the other's existence. In the fall of 1973, he matriculated at UPS Law School 66 and continued courting Edwards, who flew to Seattle several times to stay with him. They discussed marriage. At one point he introduced her to Davis as his fiancée. 33. In January 1974, Bundy abruptly broke off all contact with Edwards. Her phone calls and letters went unreturned. When she finally reached him by phone a month later, she demanded to know why he had unilaterally ended their relationship without explanation. In a flat, calm voice, he replied, "Diane, I have no idea what you mean," and hung up. She never heard from him again. 67. Bundy later explained, "I just wanted to prove to myself that I could have married her." 68. But Edwards concluded in retrospect that Ted's high-power courtship in the latter part of 1973 had been deliberately planned, that he had waited all those years to be in a position of where he could make her fall in love with him, so that he could drop her, reject her, as she had rejected him. 67. By then, Bundy had begun skipping classes at law school. By April, he had stopped attending entirely. 69. As young women began to disappear in the Pacific Northwest. 70. First murders. There is no consensus as to when or where Bundy began killing women. He told different stories to different people and refused to divulge the specifics of his earliest crimes, even as he confessed in graphic detail to dozens of later murders in the days preceding his execution. 71. He told Nelson that he attempted his first kidnapping in 1969 in Ocean City but did not kill anyone until sometime in 1971 in Seattle. 72. He told psychologist Art Norman that he killed 2 women in Atlantic City while visiting family in Philadelphia in 1969. 73-74. Bundy hinted to homicide detective Robert Keppel that he committed a murder in Seattle in 1972-75 and another murder in 1973 that involved a hitchhiker near Tumwater, but he refused to elaborate. 76. Rule and Keppel both believed that he might have started killing as a teenager. 77-78. Bundy's earliest documented homicides were committed in 1974, when he was 27. By his own admission, he had by then mastered the necessary skills in the era before DNA profiling to leave minimal incriminating forensic evidence at crime scenes. 79. Murder spree in the Western States. Washington, Oregon. Linda Ann Healy. Shortly after midnight on January 4, 1974, around the time that he terminated his relationship with Edwards, Bundy entered the basement apartment of 18-year-old Karen Sparks 80, often identified as Joni Lentz 81-82, Mary Adams 83 and Terry Caldwell 84 in Bundy literature, a dancer and student at UW in the University District, Seattle. After bludgeoning Sparks with a metal rod from her bed frame, he sexually assaulted her with the same rod. 68-85-82, causing extensive internal injuries and rupturing her bladder. She remained unconscious in the hospital for 10 days. 84 and although she survived, she was left with permanent brain damage, with significant loss to her vision and hearing. In the early morning hours of February 1, Bundy broke into the basement room of 21-year-old Linda Ann Healy, a UW undergraduate who broadcast morning radio weather reports for skiers. He beat her unconscious, dressed her in blue jeans, a white blouse and boots, and carried her away. 86. Bundy stated he drove Healy to a secluded area, where he raped and murdered her before dumping her body. 87. During the first half of 1974, female college students disappeared at the rate of about one per month. On March 12, Donna Gail Manson, a 19-year-old student at Evergreen State College in Olympia, 60 miles, 95 kilometers, southwest of Seattle, left her dormitory to attend a jazz concert on campus but never arrived. 88 Bundy claimed that he burned Manson's skull in his girlfriend's fireplace down to the last ash in a fit of paranoia and cleanliness. 89 On April 17, 18-year-old Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared while on her way to her dorm room after an evening advisors meeting at Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, 110 miles, 175 kilometers, southeast of Seattle. 8892 female Central Washington students later came forward to report encounters, one on the night of Rancourt's disappearance, the other 3 nights earlier with a man wearing a sling, who was asking for help carrying a load of books to his brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. 9192. On May 6, Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, left her dormitory at Oregon State University in Corvallis, 93 260 miles, 420 kilometers, south of Seattle, to have coffee with friends at the Memorial Union, but never arrived. 94 Bundy claimed that he spotted Parks in the cafeteria and persuaded her to go with him to a bar. After they got into his car, he tied up and gagged her and drove her back to Washington to be killed, raping her twice on the way. 95 Investigators from Seattle and King County grew increasingly concerned. There was no significant physical evidence, and the missing women had little in common apart from similar appearance: young, attractive, white college students with long hair parted in the middle. 96 On June 1, Brenda Carroll Ball, 22, disappeared after leaving the Flame Tavern in Burien, near Seattle-Tacoma International Airport. She was last seen in the parking lot, talking to a brown-haired man with his arm in a sling. 97 Bundy stated he brought Ball back to his residence where they had a consensual sexual encounter before he strangled her while she was sleeping, although this failed to explain the damage done to her skull. 98. In the early hours of June 11, 18-year-old UW student Georgianne Hawkins vanished while walking down a brightly lit alley between her boyfriend's dormitory residence and her sorority house. 99 The next morning, 3 Seattle homicide detectives and a criminalist combed the entire alleyway on their hands and knees, finding nothing. 100 Bundy later told Cowell that he lured Hawkins to his car and knocked her unconscious with a crowbar. After handcuffing her, he drove her to Issaquah, a suburb 20 miles, 30 kilometers, east of Seattle, where he strangled her and spent the entire night with her body. 101-102 The next afternoon he returned to the UW alley and, in the very midst of a major crime scene investigation, located and gathered Hawkins's earrings and one of her shoes where he had left them in the adjoining parking lot and departed, unobserved. It was a feat so brazen, wrote Cowell, that it astonishes police even today. 103 Bundy said he revisited Hawkins's corpse on 3 occasions. 104. After Hawkins's disappearance was publicized, witnesses came forward to report seeing a man on crutches, with a leg cast and carrying a briefcase, in an alley behind a nearby dormitory on the night of her disappearance. 105 One woman recalled that the man asked her to help him carry the case to his car, a light brown Volkswagen Beetle. 106 During this period, Bundy was working in Olympia as the assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where he wrote a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. 107 Later, he worked at the Department of Emergency Services, DEA, a state government agency involved in the search for the missing women. At the DEA he met and began dating Carol Ann Boone, 1947-2018. A twice-divorced mother of 2 who would play an important role in the final phase of his life 6 years later. 108. A light tan rusty Volkswagen is positioned for display behind a chain made of handcuffs. Bundy's 1968 Volkswagen Beetle, in which he committed many of his crimes. The vehicle was on display at the now-defunct National Museum of Crime and Punishment. 109-110 and is now at the Alcatraz East Crime Museum in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. 111. Reports of the brutal attack on Sparks and the 6 missing women appeared prominently in newspapers and on television throughout Washington and Oregon. 112 Fear spread among the population, hitchhiking by young women dropped sharply 113, pressure mounted on law enforcement agencies 114, but the scarcity of physical evidence severely hampered them. Police would not provide reporters with the little information that was available for fear of compromising the investigation. 115 further similarities between the victims were noted. The disappearances all took place at night, usually near ongoing construction work, and were within a week of midterm or final exams. All of the victims were wearing slacks or blue jeans when they disappeared, and at many crime scenes there were sightings of a man wearing a cast or a sling and driving a brown or tan Volkswagen Beetle. 116. The Oregon and Washington murders culminated on July 14 with the broad daylight abductions of two women from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in Issaquah. 117. Four female witnesses described an attractive young man wearing a white tennis outfit with his left arm in a sling, speaking with a light accent, perhaps Canadian or British. Introducing himself as Ted, he asked their help in unloading a sailboat from his tan or bronze-colored Volkswagen Beetle. 3 refused. 1 accompanied him as far as his car, saw that there was no sailboat, and fled. 3 additional witnesses saw him approach Janice Ann Odt, 23, a probation caseworker at the King County Juvenile Court, with the sailboat story and watched her leave the beach in his company. 118. About 4 hours later, Denise Marie Naslund, a 19-year-old woman who was studying to become a computer programmer, left a picnic to go to the restroom and never returned. 119. Bundy told Stephen Michaud and FBI agent William Hagmeyer that Odt was still alive when he returned with Naslund and that he forced one to watch as he assaulted and murdered the other. 120. 121. 122. But he later denied it in an interview with Lewis on the eve of his execution. 123. King County Police, finally armed with a detailed description of their suspect and his car, posted flyers throughout the Seattle area. A composite sketch was printed in regional newspapers and broadcast on local television stations. Klopfer, Rule, a day employee, and a UW psychology professor all recognized the profile, the sketch, and the car, and reported Bundy as a possible suspect. 124. But detectives who were receiving up to 200 tips per day. 125 thought it unlikely that a clean-cut law student with no adult criminal record could be the perpetrator. 126. On September 6, 2 grouse hunters stumbled across the skeletal remains of Odt and Naslund near a service road in Issaquah, 2 miles, 3 kilometers, east of Lake Sammamish State Park. 117. 127. An extra femur and several vertebrae found at the site were later identified by Bundy as those of Hawkins. 128. 6 months later, forestry students from Green River Community College discovered the skulls and mandibles of Healy, Rancourt, Parks, and Ball on Taylor Mountain, where Bundy frequently hiked, just east of Issaquah. Manson's remains were never recovered. 129. Idaho, Utah, Colorado. 565 First Avenue, Salt Lake City, Utah. Rooming house in Salt Lake City where Bundy lived from September 1974 to October 1975, showing the fire escape used to sneak into his room and windows to the utility room where he concealed photo souvenirs of his murders. 130. In August 1974, Bundy received a second acceptance from the University of Utah Law School and moved to Salt Lake City, leaving Klopfer in Seattle. While he called Klopfer often, he dated at least a dozen other women. 131. As he studied the first-year law curriculum a second time, he was devastated to find out that the other students had some intellectual capacity, that he did not. He found the classes completely incomprehensible. "It was a great disappointment to me," he said. 132. A new string of homicides began the following month, including 2 that would remain undiscovered until Bundy confessed to them shortly before his execution. On September 2, Bundy raped and strangled a still unidentified hitchhiker in Idaho, then returned the next day to photograph and dismember the corpse before disposing of the remains in a nearby river. 133. 134. 135. On October 2, he abducted 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox in Holiday, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. 137 Bundy confessed that Wilcox was walking on a poorly lit main roadway when he parked his car and forced her into an orchard. He then restrained her and put her into his vehicle and drove back to his apartment, where he allegedly kept her for 24 hours. 138 Bundy informed investigators that her remains were buried near Capitol Reef National Park, some 200 miles, 320 kilometers, south of Holiday, but they were never found. 139. On October 18, Melissa Ann Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of the police chief of Midvale, another Salt Lake City suburb, disappeared after leaving a pizza parlor at around 9:30 p.m. Her nude body was found in a nearby mountainous area 9 days later. Post-mortem examination indicated that she may have remained alive for up to 7 days following her disappearance. 141 On October 31, Laura Anna May, also 17, disappeared 25 miles, 40 kilometers, south of Lehigh after leaving a Halloween party by herself just after midnight. She was last seen trying to hitchhike. 142 Her naked body was found by hikers 9 miles, 14 kilometers, to the northeast in American Fork Canyon on Thanksgiving Day. 143 The medical examiner estimated that May had died on November 20, 20 days after her disappearance. Both Smith and May had been beaten, raped, sodomized, and strangled with nylon stockings. 145 years later, Bundy described his post-mortem rituals with the corpses of Smith and May, including hair shampooing and application of makeup. 147 In the late afternoon of November 8, Bundy approached 18-year-old telephone operator Carol Duronk at Fashion Place Mall in Murray. 148 less than a mile from the Midvale restaurant where Smith was last seen. He identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department and told Duronk that someone had attempted to break into her car. He asked her to accompany him to the station to file a complaint. When Duronk pointed out to Bundy that he was driving on a road that did not lead to the police station, he immediately pulled onto the shoulder and attempted to handcuff her. During their struggle, he inadvertently fastened both handcuffs to the same wrist, and Duronk was able to open the car door and escape. 149 Later that evening, Deborah Jean Kent, a 17-year-old student at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, 20 miles, 30 kilometers, north of Murray, disappeared after leaving a theater production at the school to pick up her brother. 150 The school's drama teacher and a student told police that a stranger had asked each of them to come out to the parking lot to identify a car. Another student later saw the same man pacing in the rear of the auditorium, and the drama teacher spotted him again shortly before the end of the play. 151 Outside the auditorium, investigators found a key that unlocked the handcuffs removed from Duronk's wrist. 152 Bundy eventually admitted to abducting Kent and keeping her at his apartment for a day, stating she was alive during half of it. 153 In November, Klopfer called King. If you like this video, please like, comment about your thoughts on this, subscribe and click the bell icon for further notifications.